I basically manage 401ks and pensions now. But I did the first 5 years of my career, I did personal planning. So now in my work, I actually do a lot of education for employees on how to save and things like that. So I'm a retirement plan nerd at this point, but I'm very passionate about this topic because in my own story, I'll just kind of share some of it. My wife and I, she's one of six kids. I'm one of 12. Kind of grew up in similar but different households. So um, my my background is actually so I'm the third oldest. There's even split between six boys and six girls, and my family's a good example of I think how God wants you to think about finances within marriage. My parents got married when at a time they've been married for they're both 65, but they've been married for over 40. It'll be 45 years this summer. So they got married really young. My dad never went to school. My dad was barely Catholic. My mom was very Catholic. And I don't think my dad, if you would have told my dad when they got married that they were going to have 12 kids, nobody in his family, not him, no one would have ever said that it was possible. Um, and so and this still has a point, my financial story actually is when I was growing up, nobody went to college in my family. So I went to Coon Rapids High School, went to Catholic grade school, went to a public high school, and because my parents couldn't afford a Catholic high school with 12 kids. And so I wanted to go into the trades. I went to actually a construction trades background. I was going to own my own company because that's what everyone in my family did. They didn't necessarily own a construction company, but they didn't go to school. So that's what I was going to do. And then somehow I got kind of thrown off that path and ended up in seminary. And actually, I know it's a long path. I got tricked into going to bowling and pizza, and then I heard one talk from the rector, who is now pastor. His name is Father Bear, who actually is like the priesthood hero of Father Spencer Howell, who's here. So Spencer and I were actually Father Spencer and I were classmates at SJV together, and so I was super happy to come talk to you guys. But by way of background, I went to seminary and I was committed, and I thought I was going to become a priest. And so student loans were not in the forefront of my mind. I was thinking I'd be a priest. God will take care of it. And then I signed up to study in Rome, which I was super excited. And went to Rome, and I was wavering a little bit, like, am I going to be a priest or not? And in my junior year, when I went, I'm like, all right. And so seminary, for those who don't know, is an 8-year program if you start from the beginning. So I was 3 years into 8, and I had been kind of waffling, but I was like, you know what? This is the year I'm going to commit. And so I said to God, I'm in. Like, I'm going to do it the whole way. This is going to happen. And in Rome, I had a spiritual director, which you kind of meet with, like, they kind of basically help me with the spiritual stuff. I also had a formator that basically tells me all the human things I need to work on. And my spiritual director, the first day in Rome, met with me, and then he was like, hey, by the way, I'm leaving in 2 weeks, and so you're going to have to find a new one because I got to go back to the States. And so I was like, oh, well, that's great. And so then the program director ended up becoming my spiritual director as a priest. And about 2 months in, I was in a chapel in the Piazza del Popolo, where we've ever been in Rome. There's like 2 twin churches, and I can't remember which one. I haven't been back to Rome since, but I was sitting in there praying, and it came to me very distinctly that I was supposed to leave. And I actually got mad at God. I was like, I did all this work. I'm on this path. And then, like, the practical side of finances came in. What kind of philosophy major? What am I going to do? And so, and at that same time, my now wife was also studying on the same semester, and she was dating the Catholic dreamboat baseball player who came from a wealthy family, like very, like from the South, so he's like a gentleman. He's a perfect fit. He was. He's great. His name was Chris. So her friends were literally every time because we didn't spend a lot of time in the group together because the seminary is a little bit separate. But every time we're around him, they're like, "Oh, Chris is going to propose when we get back, and it's going to be great." For some reason, I couldn't stop wanting to sit by her and things, and I just was like, "Okay, this is the wrong thought process." But secretly, I was living as a seminarian. right? Like, so like my spiritual director said, I know you heard this voice, stay with it, don't tell anyone. Like, just see if it sticks. You don't want to make a rash choice over here. So I didn't tell anyone, not even my best friend Isaac, who conned me into the seminary. And so then the last week in Rome, I was like, okay. The spiritual said, you should tell people before you go back so that you're not like, they don't feel betrayed. So I had this master plan, and I was like, I kept fishing from her friends, Amory's friends. I'm like, okay, how serious is this Chris guy? Because I'm getting some vibes, and I'm like, I know I'm in seminary, so I'm a little rusty, you know. and it ended up that the last night we were in St. Peter's Square, and I'm saying, okay, this would be a really good moment to tell her in my head. So I pull her aside, and like, it's at night, it's amazing, all the lights are on. And I pull her aside, and I go, hey, I just wanted to let you know first that I'm leaving seminary. And my wife looks at me and says, oh, good luck. And then literally turns around. And I'm like, damn, I totally misjudged that one. And so then later on, it ended up being that she secretly was excited and then called her boyfriend and told him not to come to the airport, and the rest is history. But for finances, the reason I start with that story is because I didn't know where I was going with the amount of kids I had in my family. There was no financial support. I had a mountain of debt from St. Thomas because my dad made just enough money to not qualify for FAFSA, but they don't take into account the fact that you have 12 kids. So I had loans. My wife came from a family that, you know, they had 6 kids, so she had loans. And so my first point I would make to you guys when you're talking about marriage prep with finances is, if you haven't shared your finances with your future spouse, you should have that conversation. So share like, hey, do you have any debt? I mean, it sounds crazy that you probably know, like you might all be like, oh, we know each other's finances, but some people don't. And so my first big recommendation is, if you haven't had a finance talk, even though it sounds bad, do it over a glass of wine or a cocktail so that it loosens it up. But start to talk about like, hey, here's my finances. And also share like, here's how my family thought about finances. Because those two things, where you're at and your thought about finances, doesn't always come up in marriage prep, right? In your engagement. And so sharing where you're at and where you think you want to be, like, where do you think you want to live? What kind of lifestyle are we gonna? How many kids are we gonna have? All the things that you've been learning about, which is great because like, this is a great format. Those things all take money, right? And so you have to be on the same page. If we have kids, are one of us going to stay with the kids? Are we going to do daycare? Like all those types of things. Even though it might be a little scary if you haven't had those discussions, it's way better to have them now. And so I know this because in the first 5 years of my career, I did personal finance, and I had more budget meetings than probably anyone in the history of a 5-year period because I was trying to pay back my loans. And so I met with anyone, and a lot of them, because it came from a Catholic background, they were people just like you guys, where they were newly married. Somebody would find out they're newly married, and I was like the Catholic financial planner extraordinaire. But then I realized quickly that I needed to shift into corporate plans because none of the people that were getting married had enough money to actually invest with me. But I did the budgets, and actually that would be my other thing is when you go to do, like, I would say start with the high level conversation about finances and then get into more like budgeting, okay? But I would say start from there and have that dialogue. And when you do, the second piece I would recommend is like, and people have mentioned this in their different talks today, remember that it's like God's finances. So what is he calling you to do? And it's all wrapped into one. So I would view finances as like, and I mean, you have to remind yourself, like, just because science says your heart has to beat a certain amount of times doesn't mean that God has to hold it that way. Same with your finances. You can think that you're in control of it and you have no idea. And so you really need to pray about finances together, honestly, because the part of the story that I'm going to tell you now is that when we got married, it's great, engagement, perfect. I got a financial planning job. She was working downtown for Capella University. But we hadn't actually shared our finances all. I mean, we shared them, but we didn't like sit there and say, okay, what's happening here? So we got married. Then we started learning about each other's finances. And we realized that we had a small mortgage, or not even a small mortgage, a mortgage, just in our student loans. So that kind of hit us and sank in. And then baby came about 18 months later. There was something called cash for clunkers, and there was also like, so like we got married in 2009. So right as like I started finances, by the way, in 2008. So I was like, woo! And then like about 6 months in, they're like, the market is just cratering, and so like no one has money. So it's not. It was very financially taxing for us because the way I started is basically a $2,000 training bonus and a slap on the back, and then there was no more base income. And so my wife was basically breadwinner, and I was trying to make it all work, and it got really stressful. And so we ended up getting a house instead of an apartment because we got this $8,000 in cash to buy a house that was happening in 08, 09. And then I had some success in my career, but then it slowed down. And I had made investment, like I had hired an employee, and I had office rent. And so what ended up happening was we got a mortgage, we had student loans. I started with a line of credit that I didn't pull on, but then when things started to slow down, I started drawing on it, and it became this like crushing weight. And so there was one point in our marriage where I had to call my wife and say, and we had one kid at the time and we were expecting another. And I was like, hey, everything that we're doing, I am trying to, I was working crazy amount of hours. I'm like, I'm doing everything I possibly can. She had decided to stay at home and not work, and we still had all those bills. And I'm like, you can't buy groceries today. And she's like, what? And I'm like, yeah, you can't go buy groceries today. We gotta like make whatever work, and we gotta figure this out. And then that's when I don't think I have felt that low as a person, as a husband in my entire life. I mean, it was the hardest day. I mean, even talking about it, I almost want to cry. It was heart wrenching. And my wife said to me, she goes, I believe in you, and I didn't marry you for money, which she definitely did not marry me for money. Or looks or anything else. But it got to that point where we had to go through the pain, and then actually the job I got out of that, I started meeting with my mentors and like, I think you just need to take a look outside. I think you're in the wrong company, but you're really talented. And then from there, slowly but surely, it went a different way. And I think part of, I would never have scripted anything. Like you go from construction trades to seminary to finance. And if you knew me as a kid, never in a million years would you think finance. And I wouldn't have even thought finance ever. And that's the other thing about why you got to keep it with God. So you got to be transparent. You got to talk about it, go through a budget, and then bring God into it and say, God, I don't know how this is going to work, but I am telling you, providence is real. If you looked at my story and you saw all the details and the numbers I'm talking about, they were not small numbers. It was big numbers. And there was lots of stress around it. And I have no idea how God put everything in place, but if you could see the things that he's done, it's unbelievable with finances. And so the other thing I would tell you is when you learn about your future spouse's finances, you sit down and do a budget. The other thing about a budget, if that's hard, do it with, and it could be a financial planner, although if you don't want to go through the rigmarole of that, it could be a friend or a parent who you know is good with finances. Having a third party is extremely important because it can start to remove some of the friction that's there, and it can get real so that and the part of the budgeting too, especially if it's somebody that's been a little bit older, they can give you some insight into how you're blending your finances and how you're building your family. So like you don't want to buy too big of a house, let's say, or you want to be on the same page about, okay, if we're going to stay at home, buy a house, move someplace, does our finances actually make all that work? And it's not like you have, I'm not saying like it all has to work exactly and fit in a box and okay, now that we have this much money, we're gonna have baby number two. It doesn't work that way, but having some transparency, some thought process into it is helpful. So share, budget, pray. Remember that it's God's money that he's giving you and the ability to wake up every day and do that. And so when it comes to tithing, here's my biggest thing that I tell people all the time when they ask me. 10% is the goal. And if you can do it right away, you should do it. Because you're never going to be outpaid. And I am telling you, this comes from my situation I just told you about. But then remember, I'm from a family of 12 kids. My dad never went to college. He got promoted every time my mom had a baby within 6 months for the last 10 kids. And like, I was on the older end, so I saw how skinny it was financially. And by the end, it got better. But you need God to be in there. And my dad told me that he started tithing at a certain point. So if you can't get to 10, do something that's meaningful. So like you've all heard the parable of the widow's mite, where she puts in the coin. God knows, okay, he knows everything, right? So we talk about confession and everything. He knows everything. So he knows if you have it or if you don't. And if you have it, you got to give it. And that sometimes is hard and you got to be on the same page about it. And if you don't have enough to make it all go around and you can't make it all the way to 10, give as much as you can and then make sure the time is balancing out the money that you can't give and then chip away. So like I manage corporate retirement plans, I manage 401ks. What's the biggest thing they say? Maximize your match. Or start by putting 1% and then the next year you go 1%. Generally speaking, for most people's career path, the longer you're in it, the better you are, the more money you're gonna make. If you can only do 3 or 5% of your tithe now, just commit to, just like you would in like a retirement plan, going up by 1%. But be realistic with God. If you can do it right away, you might actually be able to do it right away, and then it flips the other way, where life will have a circumstance where you can't. God knows where you're at. And so, but he will never, ever be outdone in generosity, ever. So when you're thinking about your finances and you're going through everything, sharing, budgeting, praying about that, and then giving God his in the right proportion and being okay with it, that is a recipe for success. And finances is one of the number one reasons why marriages end up in divorce and things like that. So it'd be way better to have a discussion about it now and be aligned, and actually it will help you. And if you bring God into it, finances are going to be a friction point no matter what. Like it's just, life is like that. And you don't know the twists and turns. It could be health. It could be, I don't know. I mean, when you're married, how many of you guys own a home right now? Is this a true statement? To be a homeowner is to be a slave? Right? I mean, you don't know, like 1 minute it's, you're cracking a beer and then some kid's like, Dad, the toilet's overflowing. And then they're like, I can't shut it off. That happened to me. So like you could have plans. And, God has a way of detaching you from money. I mean, every person who's been married, I mean, you don't even have to be married to know that, but with kids, they'll definitely strip you down to the bare minimum of everything. So, but when it comes to finances, seek outside help if you need it. Because actually, a lot of times, you might end up in a doomsday scenario, like if with finances. And generally, you want to know the temperament of your spouse's financial picture. So, like, some people are savers, some people are spenders. You kind of want to know what your spouse is, right? So, if you know your spouse is a spender, maybe you help them with that. Or it sounds funny, but if your spouse is a miser or a saver, you might need to help them spend money, actually. So, like, knowing where you're coming from can help can help save a lot of pain. There's still going to be pain, it's still going to be hard, but I think having transparency around it, having open dialogue as the different seasons of life and things come in and out, and being on the same page. I mean, you even heard it with Laura, that, you know, with the kids and different things and career paths, all that's got to be it's an ongoing dialogue that you have, but know that it's never insurmountable, and as bad as it could possibly seem sometimes, it's, there's always a path forward. And I think if you hit a spot where you're, and even if it's, there's an abundance, you should seek counsel as well. So I think as you prepare for marriage, having that dialogue, I mean, if you can show of hands, like, have you guys, most people, you know where you're at with finances? Most people, I mean, it's a little bit more now, but I think, and I would also say this, and it doesn't have to be this way, but my personal thing is, I know there's a trend to kind of not wanting to blend finances together. I'm not saying you have to have everything, but I would say the preference, with all the things I've dealt with in my career, the more you blend, the better it'll be. The more separate you are, it just is fraught with issues. And if it needs to start somewhere, but I would say, if you don't feel that way, you know, you could challenge me, but I would say having things on the same page and sharing on the front end is definitely something that you want to do. So hopefully that those 3 points of like share, do a budget now, if you can, even though it's not necessarily fun. And then seek outside counsel, but then the outside counsel is a human that can help you, but also God. And then make sure that you give him his, and pray about your finances for good or bad, and know that it can get better, but know that providence is real. And if God wants something to happen, like, I don't know how we're going to afford a kid, I don't know how we're going to afford fill the blank. If he wants it to happen, he will make it happen. So just be faithful, be open, and that'll be a recipe for success for your finances.
Yeah, wonderful. Does anybody?
Do you want to take a question or two?
Sure.
I think
Any
this is one
questions?
where.
Yeah.
We've been talking about this one, like very recently.
Yeah.
We've got about like 50K combined in student debt, no other debt. Huh? Okay, a little bit less, you know, depending on what the government does.
Yep.
Student loans.
Yep.
And we're at a point, I think in September, we're like, okay, do we, like, we've paid for our own way at this point, you know, and we're like, okay, that, we can do that now, we know we can save that much, and it'll like be about that much for our student loans. The question is like, do we attack student loans next, right after we get married, or if, okay, student loans are more stable, do we start saving more cash on hand to have for like, if the kid comes in the next 2 years?
Yep, great question. This is universal advice for any type of situation like that. I think, like, how many, you guys have heard of Dave Ramsey, right? Okay. Love what Dave Ramsey does, except there's a few tweaks I make to it. The biggest thing that I disagree with is that I don't think, because I've seen so many people do this, where they'll attack the debt so aggressively that they don't save. And so it's almost like a simultaneous thing. So I'll just use a hypothetical, okay? You've got the student loans, you want to save. And let's say between the two of you, you've got, I'm just going to throw an easy number out, say it's $1,000 extra a month. And you have to choose between what you do, and I'm assuming that's with like all the other stuff. If you have a choice between throwing $1,000 all at the student loans or saving and not putting any extra, do some type of split. It's because the emergency fund is always going to be tapped for something. There's always going to be something until you, unless you're very wildly successful, then it might be different. But in that scenario, you want to pay down your debt, but you want to do it once you've got a fairly decent, 3 to 6 months of expenses in your emergency fund, so that you can actually have a stable. If somebody would have given me that advice in the front end, it would have been really helpful. Because what I did is I tried to attack it right away, and then I didn't have my reserve, and then I tapped into, ended up getting credit, and that's where you get into this cycle. And so you always want to have some emergency or kind of cash on hand for the unexpected. And that will prevent you from getting caught in like a credit card kind of cycle. That'll always be able to allow it to break. But if you don't do that and you pay off everything and an emergency comes, you're gonna be putting on some type of credit or some type of loan, then you're right back into the cycle. I'm not against debt, actually, if it's responsible, it has to just be well thought out. And you gotta be realistic about, okay, don't fill up the debt bucket so much or your monthly payment buckets that you can't actually flex or move around it. I think American society is so prone to just loan, like everything's on loan. That and then if anything happens, you don't have any emergency fund, or if you put too many payments into your monthly payment, it can just feel like you're drowning. So hopefully that's helpful. So I would say at least split it, or I would even say build up the emergency fund if you don't have it post-wedding. And then once you have like around 3 months, you can start to shift, but you gotta have that emergency there. That helps a lot with just the everyday car maintenance, medical bill, things like that.
Question, this is more related to like 401ks and so forth. Is there like a Catholic sort of like 401k that we can like maybe explore if that's a thing? Cause like, last year I did a good chunk, like I think I put like almost like 8,000 to my 401k. Then that's not including match plus stocks and everything else, but I was just more curious to know like does the Catholic Circle have something where instead of like giving it to like Fidelity or BlackRock, we can like use it within the church?
There are Catholic social responsible funds. So they're like the most well-known one is like Ave Maria funds. There's also a large fund company that was founded by Harry Markowitz, who was the father of modern portfolio theory, the person who like invented like how people monitor finances and everything. There's a company called DFA, Dimensional Fund Advisors, but most people just know them as DFA. They actually have like very specific Catholic funds out there. Also, the Knights of Columbus have come out with some, and there's also one called Aquinas funds after St. Thomas Aquinas. How you get to those is a little more complicated. You got to find somebody who knows about them and understands them. Some of those are more marketing than they are substance. But I would say, like, I've wrestled this. One of the professors at St. Thomas in the Catholic Studies program, Dr. Kennedy, he's closer to retirement than now. He's actually the world's leading expert at social responsible investing. And I didn't know it, but I was in my job and I was reading an article and it said, Dr. Kennedy, and I'm like, this can't be the same Dr. Kennedy. So then I called him, because he was my philosophy teacher and business teacher, and he's like, yep, that's me. And I fly around the world like I don't really advertise it at St. Thomas, but I am an expert. And so I would say though, the reason I'm bringing that up is social, like Catholic investing, I wouldn't get too hung up on it because it can be a trap, I think. And that like you can end up getting into more, I don't know, it can be burdensome to try to get there. So I would say pray about it. You can ask around, but I wouldn't just say, go to somebody who's good and is Catholic. Don't just go to somebody who's Catholic. I know that sounds weird, but you got to kind of vet it and you got to figure it out because I've vetted it a lot. And people aren't trying to do it intentionally, but there's a lot of bad advice out there that happens in those spaces. So I would say, seek out that counsel, but I can help you maybe offline. I don't do individual planning, but there are people that I do know, and there's better ones than not. So.
Hey, Lauren, and this hopefully is applicable to everyone. One thing I struggle with tithing is like I feel like I'm pretty generous, like saving the money, that was huge Catholic wedding, and that kind of thing. So that's also made tithing tricky. But one thing I struggle with is the 10% like pre-gross or like is it pre-taxes and after you put everything in or after? The math is like
no, I don't want to speak for Father, but that might be a little scrupulous. They'll take, if you knew what the average Catholic gave as a percentage, it's not even close to 10%. So I would say, But I would say that how I counsel people as I've done budgets is I would say it's 10% of whatever you have access to. So I generally say 10% of whatever you're netting. If you can afford to do it as a gross, by all means, but as you started, do it as what you take in. So I'll give an example. Say, for easy math, you made $10,000 pre-tax and post-tax it's 8,000. You tithe off the 8,000 because that's what you have access to. If you have an abundance and you can go to the 10%, the 10,000, then go for it. But it's generally based off of what you're taking home.
That was very helpful. So I've been trouble with that. I feel like it's paralyzed me from timing, which isn't good either.
Well, and I think too, the other thing is like, if you have an abundance and you can do even more, like God will ask you to do it. Just like God will give you providence when you least expect it, he'll also ask you for money when you least expect it if you have it, so.
Okay, that's good.
Okay.
Thank you.